Okay, I can see you. I
Okay.
can see myself.
Good morning in the States, Prof.
Good morning. I'm so
We
sorry.
have all been waiting for you.
I've,
You might have
I've,
misunderstood time difference.
I thought it was 7.5 hours.
Okay, anyway, it's good to have you here.
Okay.
Just let me start from the beginning. Hello and a very warm welcome to today's webinar. Session 6 of QMS Applied Linguistics webinar series 1. Thank you for taking time out and being here. Your valued presence is highly appreciated. I also would like to thank our guest speaker today for honoring our invitation to deliver a webinar despite his conceivably hectic schedule. Our guest speaker today, James P. Lantolf, who is with no doubt one of the existing pillars of SLA and Applied Linguistics, is an adjunct professor in the School of Foreign Studies at Xianjiao University. He is career professor emeritus in language acquisition and applied linguistics in the Department of Applied Linguistics at the Pennsylvania State University. He was president of the American Association for Applied Linguistics, 2005, and in 2016, he received the Distinguished Scholarship and Service Award from that association. He was co-editor of Applied Linguistics, Oxford University Press, from 1993 to 1998, and is founding editor of Language and Sociocultural Theory, Equinox Press, established in 2013. His research focuses on sociocultural theory and second language development. He has published over 170 journal articles, book chapters, encyclopedia entries, and book reviews. He is co-author of Sociocultural Theory and the Genesis of Second Language Development, 2006, Oxford University Press. His 2014 co-authored book, Sociocultural Theory and the Pedagogical Imperative, Vygotskian Praxis and the L2 Research Practice Divide, Routledge Press, received the Mildenberger Prize of the Modern Language Association of America. He has published several edited and co-edited volumes, including Vygotskian Approaches to Second Language Research, Sociocultural Theory and Second Language Learning, Sociocultural Theory and the Teaching of Second Languages, 2008, and most recently, the Routledge Handbook of Sociocultural Theory and Second Language Development, 2018. As for the topic of today's webinar, dear colleagues, looking retrospectively, let's say, at the past 30 years in the field of second language education, one may discern the proliferation and continuation of two ontologically contradictory paradigms and incommensurable theories, Thomas Kuhn's terms, that is cognitive and sociocultural into the present time. As the title speaks for itself, Professor Lantolf will be talking about these two parallel SLA worlds, which have strongly, let's say, affected our orientation as language researchers and language teachers to the phenomenon of language in general and language teaching and learning enterprise in particular. I'm sure you are as interested as I am to listen to Professor Lantolf. So with that, over to you, Professor Lantolf. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Can you see my slides?
You need to upload the slides, Prof. There is an icon, just top right-hand corner of the page, a square with a triangle in the middle.
Yeah, it won't. Okay, so it should work now, right? Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Okay, so here we go.
Please, go
All
ahead.
right. Okay. So I want to thank you for inviting me, and I want to apologize for the mix-up in the time. It was my fault. I miscalculated. I thought it was 7.5 hours. Um, and I was sitting here just waiting for the time to start. So at any rate, I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to speak with everyone today about this project that I've been doing for quite a while. And I call it the crisis in SLA. And it's the cognitive and social divide and what to do about it. That is basically about what's inside the head and what's outside the head, and how can we get these two pieces of the SLA puzzle together. So actually, I think, hold on. Okay, can you see it now? Okay, so there. Can you see my screen?
We can't see the slides.
I don't understand why you can't see.
I think you first need to upload the files,
Yeah,
under
I
Skyro.
did. I did. Yeah, I did. Okay, can you see it now?
Yes, yes. But
Okay.
can you please maximize the page?
Yeah, now it is. It is now. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. All right. So there are actually two crises in second language studies. The one is the cognitive and social gap that I am going to talk about today. But there's another one, and that I've just written a paper on, and that's the theory research gap. But that's a topic for a different presentation. And there's actually perhaps a third crisis, which is the proliferation of theories. And I'll say something more about that a little bit later. So I'm going to talk about then the so-called cognitive social gap. And what I'm going to do is talk about the nature and the origin of the crisis. Where does this come from? Why it's a problem? And what we can do about it? How can we perhaps overcome the gap? Following, I think, a similar approach that Vygotsky used to deal with the crisis in psychology at his time, which was a crisis between idealist psychology of the Freudian phenomenological type and the materialist behaviorist, Watson, Pavlov, Thorndike, Skinner type of crisis, which created this dualism in the field. And I think that's what SLA is confronting today. Okay, so so the nature of the crisis, I think, is the following. What is the relationship between the cognitive
Excuse me,
and
Prof.
the social? Yes.
Excuse me, my apologies. Could you please press F5 button?
Yes. Okay.
Because we don't have the full screen for the slides.
Yeah, I just pressed it.
Welcome to VoiceOver. VoiceOver speaks.
The screen has frozen.
All right, let me try it again.
Yes, yes.
Is it okay now?
It is okay, but it is minimized.
Let me try it again. Can you see it now?
You should zoom in 100. They say now it is on 52.
Is
Yes.
that better?
Yes, yes. It's fine. It's
Okay.
fine. Thanks.
We're good now? Okay. Okay. Sorry. So this is the problem. What is the relationship between the cognitive and the social? And Kathy Dowdy and Mike Long argue the following, that SLA does occur in social contexts. We all know that. But their argument is that SLA might be influenced a little bit by the micro and macro context. But language learning, like all learning, they say, is a matter of change in an individual's internal mental state. Well, to some extent, that's true. But their conclusion then is that SLS, second language studies, and I make a distinction between SLA, second language acquisition, and the field, which I will call second language studies. Their argument is that it's a branch of cognitive science, and that SLA is a psycholinguistic process which ultimately resides in the mind-brain, which is where you have to look. And my argument is going to be that we're looking in the wrong place. You don't look in the mind-brain, you have to look somewhere else. And I will try to make that argument as we go along. So Long says then, in a 1998 publication, that if we remove the learner from the social setting and the L2 grammar doesn't change, or disappear. He says, change the social setting from the street to the classroom, or from the foreign to a second language environment. And as far as we know, the way the learner acquires does not change much either, as suggested by comparison of error types, developmental sequences, processing constraints, and so on. And the argument that I'm going to make is that if you change the social setting, you actually do change the process of acquiring a second language. And that is, psycholinguistically, acquiring a language, let's say in a classroom, can be quite different from acquiring a language in an immersion setting. So Dowdy and Long then argue that second language studies, its basic research agenda, if you don't consider its applications, is the following. It's to identify the nature and sources of underlying L2 knowledge, explain the developmental success or failure of learners, test divergent theories, that is grammatical nativism, some sort of Chomskyan model, general nativism, sort of a functionalist model, emergentism, which has been largely proposed by people like Nick Ellis, connectionism, largely proposed by people like Brian McQuinney. What's the relationship between language and thought? Where and how does the brain store and retrieve linguistic knowledge in the brain's adaptation to things like multilingualism and multilingual aphasia, for example? So basically, their argument is you have to look inside the person, inside the head, if you're going to explain second language acquisition. Now, if we go back in time and try to figure out where the crisis comes from, why are we in a crisis? If we go back to the origins of applied linguistics, and granted, this is a very brief overview, I'm leaving out a lot of the detail. In the early days of applied linguistics, the leading figures, such as Robert Lotto, perhaps, in the United States, Pitt Corder in the United Kingdom, made the argument that SLA, that applied linguistics was not a producer of theories, but it was a consumer of theories. So what their task was to look around for really good descriptive theories of a target language, whether it be English or Farsi or Chinese or Russian, whatever the case may be. Then it was to incorporate the description of this language into a syllabus that made sense to teachers and to learners, and then develop teaching techniques to implement the syllabus. Now, during the Second World War, in the US at least, there was a great need for people to be able to use, speak, read, write, um, many different languages, and there wasn't a large reserve of people who could do this. And so the United States government approached academics, largely at universities such as Georgetown, Indiana, Cornell, Michigan, among others, to develop an approach to teaching languages really quickly, really intensively, to feed essentially what was considered to be the war effort. And out of this emerged the Army method. And this largely followed the principles of structural linguistics and behaviorism. And out of this, when this method, following the war, was transferred over to education, it became known as the audiolingual method. And I'm sure we're all familiar with audiolingual method, which was largely based on contrastive analysis, where one compared the target language with the native language. And the prediction was that where the languages were similar, you would reduce the number of errors, and where the languages were different, it would increase the number of errors, or what was called at the time interference. And so the goal was to teach the differences so that learners could overcome the problems and the interferences of their first language. Now, Pitt Corder, in the mid-60s, working in Scotland, developed what came to be known as error analysis. And what he observed was that the predictions that were made by contrastive analysis that I just mentioned were not necessarily supported by the evidence. He noticed that learners were making systematic errors that could not be explained on the basis of the similarities and differences between the target language and the native language, such as things like overgeneralizations, where people learning English would say, run, ran, on analogy with walk, walked. So out of this grew, in the late 60s and early 70s, the field of error analysis. And this eventually caught the attention of people like Burton Dulé and, of course, Steve Krashen, who then began to look more deeply at the psychological or psycholinguistic processing that learners were going through, rather than just at the languages themselves. And out of this emerged the well-known morpheme order studies, where learners of different L1s seem to follow the same sequence for acquiring a second language such as English. And this is just some of the sequence that they posited for learning English. That is, you first learn the ing, the gerund, then you learn is and plurals together, and then the irregular past, and you didn't learn the possessive until you learned the regular past, and so on. So that gave rise to an interest in the process itself rather than the applications of research. And eventually, out of these early studies, there emerged something like 60 theories, models, hypotheses, approaches, and perspectives. If you look at three of the most recent books, edited volumes, that include overviews of various theories, Dwight Atkinson's book, Mitchell and Miles, 2013, and there just came out a fourth edition of that book, and then Patton, Keating, and Wolf, which the third edition just came out, you find that there's something like at least 18 different theories or models. And I've listed them here. I won't read them all to you, but just monitor model, universal grammar, cognitive theory, sociocultural theory, dynamic systems theory, and so on. So we now have something like at least 18 different theories, all saying different things about the process of acquiring a second language. So you can see that universal grammar is going to say something very different from cognitive theory. Dynamic systems theory is going to say something very different from conversational analysis, and so on. So what are we to do? This is why there is, in many ways, a crisis. So how can we inform teachers if we have all of these different theories that are saying very different things? Some of these theories are cognitive and some of these theories are socially oriented. So one of the solutions that Long and company proposed was we need to cull the theories. We need to cut back on the theories to allow for a transition to what Kuhn called normal science, which then allows for the accumulation of data to test the validity of a dominant theory that leads to problem solving. And Long proposed some guidelines for how we go about theory culling. That is, theories have to be coherent, they have to be testable. Many people call this falsifiable. There has to be a broad scope of the theory. They have to be able to account for certain puzzles, certain problems. They have to be fruitful. That is, they have to make interesting and new predictions. And they have to be economic. That is, they can't be overly complex. But we've never done that, right? In the meantime, in the late 90s, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, many second language researchers began to challenge the dominance and the orientation, the dominance of the cognitive orientation, and to argue for a social view. And the well-known paper that appeared in the Modern Language Journal in 1967 by Firth and Wagner critiqued the cognitive approach for several reasons, one of which is it elevates the idealized native speaker above a stereotypicalized non-native speaker. It tends to look at the non-native speakers as somehow defective communicators. Now, Dwight Atkinson, in criticizing the cognitive orientation, makes to me a very appealing statement. He says that human beings as I know them, whether people on the street, students I teach and work with, professional colleagues, or those I'm close to and love, appear to act, think, and feel in ways and for reasons entirely different than those most typically featured in SLA research. So what he's saying is, if we focus on the learner, right, the stereotypical learner, we're not really dealing with flesh and blood people who are more than just cognitive systems.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Excuse me, Professor Lantal. It seems,
Yeah.
the participants have problems with, seeing the slides. The slides aren't moving
Oh,
when you are changing them.
I'm not sure what to do about that.
Yes, it is okay now.
Now it's okay?
Yes, it's okay.
Okay, so I just changed the slide. Did it change?
Yes,
Did it
it
change?
did.
So, okay, so it's summarizing the crisis, right? Is that what you can see?
Yes. It is
Okay.
critique of cognitive approach. This is what I can see.
That's
Critique
the
of
wrong slide. That's wrong.
Firth and Wagner.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so it's running behind for some reason. So you can see. So what do you see now? The social turn? Can you see Firth and Wagner?
Not now.
What are you seeing now?
Just human beings as I know them, whether people.
Yeah. That's the screen I'm on. So now I'm going to go to the next screen, and that should be summarizing the crisis.
Could you please make a little bit smaller? The page.
Oh, okay.
Yes, it's fine.
Is that better?
Yes.
So now you should see summarizing the crisis.
Yes, theory culling.
Okay. So summarizing the crisis we need to do theory culling so that you yield a dominant cognitive theory to guide normal science research. And then we should follow the research methodologies from other sciences, that is, controlled experimentation and systematic observation. That's the assumption, right? That's sort of at the core of the crisis. Theory expansion then should include social theories, right? Different research, which use different research methodologies like conversational analysis. It's more emic-based rather than etic-based in order to enhance the awareness of contextual and international dimensions of language use. So the crisis is basically the difference between 1 and 2, right? So 1 and 2, 1 wants the major theory to be cognitive theory, and then to follow normal science in Kuhn's sense. And the other side of the coin is to expand to include social factors, but not just as the site for something that happens, but as a major influence on the process of second language acquisition. So how do we deal with this cognitive social gap? Dowdy and Long say the following, that SLA does take place in a social context, and SLA might be influenced by context, but language learning ultimately is a matter of a change in the individual's internal mental state. Now, some people, just to use an example, Alison Mackey, for example, try to integrate social interaction into the context of second language acquisition, and consider the context and conditions for input, output, and feedback. So you need to weigh whatever that means, cognitive social conditions. You need to weigh the laboratory and the classroom. I'm not sure what that means. But the bottom line is that the orientation still has to be cognitive, that maybe is influenced by social concerns. So what you're seeing is the emergence of a dualism, right? And dualisms, to me, are always problematic, because then how do we resolve the dualism? We look one way, do we look the other way, do we look both ways? And what does it mean to look both ways? And I'll have something to say about that in a minute. Lourdes Ortega, in the concluding chapter of Atkinson's edited volume on alternative theories, says, she summarizes the cognitive, and which she thinks focuses on knowledge and the mechanisms of learning that reside in the mind-brain, which is another problem, right? The mind-brain is a kind of dualism, or in some cases, people think that the mind-brain means the same thing, and in my view, they're not the same thing. The mind is different from the brain. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit later in the discussion session. She says that you need to also include the social, then is knowledge and learning that's socially distributed, that people have histories, and the process is only possible through sociality. So, to make a long story short, what Ortega argues for is what I have on the bottom of the slide, is some sort of in-betweenness that says that maybe the best we can do is to be a hybrid field with fuzzy categories that are interpretive, probabilistic, and make imprecise predictions. That seems to me to be not a way out of the problem, because we're still looking in two directions, and we still don't know how to put things together in a coherent, systematic, and principled way. So for Ortega, number 3 on the next slide, which I have highlighted in blue, she says, diversity is positive. Each theory can benefit from other theories. The problem with that is, how does theory benefit from other theories? For that to happen, it would mean that those of us working in, let's say, sociocultural theory would need to be involved in what's going on in universal grammar theory, or emergentism, or in functionalism, Hallidayan theory. it would require people to be, in a sense, multi-theoretical. That and most of us don't have time to do that, and most of us are not willing to do that. It would mean to cultivate mutual engagement across differences. There have been, and I've participated in many fora at AAAL, and we've written a couple of jointly authored papers on this topic of how do we talk to each other, build bridges across the various theories.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Excuse me, Prof. I was just notified by the participants that the slides aren't moving again. They have frozen.
Boy. Where are you?
If there is someone better familiar with the technicalities of Skyroom, I can just open up the mic and he or she can explain it to Prof. Can you please upload the files on the Skyroom system? So that way, I think we would be able to see the slides.
But I did. I mean, I'll try it again.
Some people are field dependent. They can't follow you without slides. So sorry for for my interruptions.
Yeah, unfortunately, my screen is frozen now. All right, let me try it again. Yeah, can you hear me? My screen is frozen.
If the problem is persisting, no problem, Prof.
Yeah.
No problem. Please go ahead.
Well, the problem I'm having now is that my PowerPoint is frozen too. Hold on, let me see what I can do about this. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can see it.
Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, now we can see it. Yes,
Okay,
please go ahead.
Can you see it now?
It's fine, yes.
Okay, but now I have to go to where I was. I gotta skip forward.
Great.
Okay, so
it is fantastic now.
Okay. So the problem is diversity to me doesn't seem to be the solution, because and this is exactly the problem that Vygotsky confronted in psychology. There were multiple theories that were populating the discipline at his time, just as there are now multiple theories, cognitive versus social. And so I think Ortega's solution is not really a solution. Epistemological pluralism runs the risk of converting the field, it seems to me, from a science into an art, which is something that John Schumann raised in an article nearly 30 or 40 years ago, that maybe SLA or SLS, Second Language Studies, is not really a science, but it's an art. And if it's an art, then sort of anything goes. Because in art, it's just sort of about taste. I have a taste for this theory as opposed to that theory. And what does that say about how do we help teachers in the classroom? So there are all kinds of problems with a pluralistic approach to science. So Nick Ellis, for example, his solution to the problem is we have to look in two directions, like being on a two-way street. So he says there's no social cognitive divide, but he still looks in two directions. He says we can study the cognitive and we can study the social. That doesn't put things together. That and is a problem. So some people study the cognitive and some people study the social. That leaves us, in a sense, right where we are, right? So he says they're inexorably, that is, cognition, consciousness, experience, embodiment, the self, society, culture, history, are inextricably intertwined in rich and complex ways. Yeah, that's true. But to say that doesn't integrate the theories. We're still looking in two directions. That's why I think Vygotsky offers us a way out of this problem, because he shows us how to bring the cognitive and the social together. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. And the first thing I want to say is that people have misunderstood sociocultural theory because they often group it, as Long and Doughty do, with social theories. And what I want to stress is that sociocultural theory is not a social theory. It's not the same kind of theory that Firth and Wagner are talking about. It's a very different theory. And you can see what they say is that there remain identifiable groupings of scholars, socioculturalists, conversational analysts, action theorists, who persist in seeing external learner behavior and even group behavior, not mental states, as the proper domain of inquiry. That's not what sociocultural theory is about. It's not a theory that's the same as conversational analysis or action theories. It's not a social theory. It is a psychological theory. The problem that people have is when they think of psychological, they think of what's going on inside the head, and they're looking in the wrong place. So Luria, who was a colleague of Vygotsky, attended a symposium that was held in the 1960s, sponsored by the Vatican, the Catholic Church, interestingly, on brain and consciousness. And the problem that he saw at the conference, which brought together all of the major psychologists from around the world, really important figures in the field, he says they're searching for consciousness in the wrong place. They're searching for the mind in the wrong place. They're searching inside the brain. And they're looking at it in the neural formations that give rise to consciousness. Or even in terms of the macrostructural regions of the brain that control experiences and thought. So he says they're looking in the wrong place. And then looking in the wrong place, they're never going to be able to solve the problem of where does the mind come from. One of the most important dialectical philosophers to interpret Vygotsky, Ewald Ilyenkov, makes the following statement about where you look for consciousness or mind. Vygotsky called it consciousness. He says, studying the brain tells you as little about the mind as analyzing physical properties of gold, silver, or a banknote paper tells you about the nature of money. So if you want to understand what money is, you don't analyze gold, silver, and paper. You have to analyze the social relationships that have created the concept of money. You have to look at society. And that's basically what Vygotsky is saying. If you want to understand the mind, you have to look not at the biological organ of the brain. Yes, the brain matters, right? But where you have to look is in the material, humanized world that's been humanized by concrete human activity. So it's humanized reality made available to newcomers, that is children, through social interaction, which is where, as they're acculturated, which is where the mind comes from. So the mind is created in social interaction. It's not a factor. It's the source of the mind. Talizina, who was a student of Vygotsky, says that because of the social nature of man's, meaning human, psyche, humans are not born with developed abilities for thinking, remembering, etc. Rather, they assimilate these elements during their lifetime by transforming social experience into their own personal experience. Said in another way, the interpsychological becomes intrapsychological. So the mind, the place to look for the mind is in the world, in the humanized world, not inside the head. Vygotsky says, development then entails the concept of conflict, which is at the heart of dialectics, the contradiction of clash between the natural and the historical, the primitive and the cultural, the organic and the social. So what he's saying is that we are born with a brain, and that brain has certain biologically endowed instincts that we share with other life forms, largely higher primates. But that's not where the mind comes from. The mind comes from this clash of organic nature, which is the brain, with our social cultural world. And as that socio-cultural world penetrates the brain, the natural, the biological, mind emerges from that clash. So that, yes, we have a memory that we share with other animals. Animals remember things. We pay attention when you see a bright light flash or you hear a noise, you turn to it. That's an instinct, right? We see things flashing in front of our eyes. We look at them. We even have certain biologically endowed emotions like pain and fear and distress, which are there to preserve our well-being. So if somebody threatens you, you enter into a state of distress, you manifest fear, and you either fight or you flee. But that's not a human mind. That's an animal mind. The human mind has a logical memory. It has sign-mediated perception. So that before a child acquires language, and they look at a scene, let's say a room in your house, and they see all kinds of objects in there, they don't know what they're looking at. They can see things, but they can't perceive them. They only begin to perceive once they acquire language, because language then categorizes the world in specific ways. So a child doesn't know whether a lamp on a table is part of the table or whether it's a separate object until they learn the word lamp and the word and the word table, for example. They don't know that whether or not color is part of the essence of an object or whether it is a superficial part of an object, right? And so on. And that also goes for our emotions, which become semanticized. So children feel perhaps fear and distress, but they don't know what they're feeling. Adults know what fear and distress and joy and love and hate are because we have labels for them. our emotions have been semanticized. That's what Vygotsky is saying, right? So it's from the social cultural world that our mind is created. That's where you have to look. Said it another way, right? This is another way of thinking about this. So if you look at what's above the line, you have the experience of our ancestors passed on through our genes. This is our instinct, and this happens over hundreds of thousands of years, right? And you also have another kind of experience, which is the direct experience of an organism in its physical environment. So people who live in hot, dry places live in a different way from people who live in cold, snowy places, right? You don't need heavy coats if you live in a desert climate. If you live in a snowy climate, you need heavy winter coats or you're going to freeze to death. So we have those two kinds of experiences that are similar to what animals experience. But we also have this experience of what's below the line. And that's the experience of our ancestors passed on through culture. So humans have two kinds of inheritances. Biological inheritance, which we share with other animals, and our cultural inheritance, which we do not share with other animals. This is unique to humans. And we then have the direct experience of the organism in its social environment. So it's through the social interaction, through the social environment, that the experience of our ancestors captured in our artifacts, including our language, our art, our music, our literature, our belief systems, our religions, our political systems, all of those are made available to us as children. And as we come into or brought into our culture through social interaction, our mind emerges from that relationship. And that's unique to humans. So the value of consciousness, the value of mind, is that it allows us to adapt to unanticipated circumstances in the world, right? Animals have a very hard time doing that. So our instincts are geared to what's anticipated, right? Our instincts grew up over evolution as a consequence of repeated experiences of our ancestors that passed on then these biological ways of dealing with these anticipated experiences. But what about the unanticipated? And we all live in worlds in which there are unanticipated experiences. And we can deal with those because we have a mind that allows us to analyze, think about, plan a course of action to deal with those unanticipated circumstances. And this can be at the level of the individual, or it can be at the level of an entire society and culture, right? The world right now is dealing with this pandemic, right? The COVID, the coronavirus pandemic. And we're trying to deal with this as a human culture, as a human society, because one of the things that we can do under these circumstances is say no to the way the world is coming at us. So there's this terrible scourge that's now circling the world, circling the earth. And we're trying to find ways culturally, humanly, to prevent the deaths that are happening. And we, as you know, we just recently developed the vaccines to overcome this. That is the function of human consciousness, of the human mind, that animals cannot do. Animals would be wiped out. That's the value of human mind and human consciousness. Okay, so the human mind then is a functional system, and it's comprised of mediated perception by signs, by language, mediated attention, mediated memory, mediated emotions. As I just said to you, our emotions are semantic, not just physical, and it's organized symbolically to allow us to engage in purposeful activity. That is, we can plan what we're going to do. We can develop the plan before we actually implement the plan. And that allows us a better opportunity to deal with the unexpected. And it allows us to minimize the risk of acting because we can act mentally before we act physically. That's the value of having a socially generated mind or socially generated consciousness. Okay. So, as Vygotsky puts it then, the mind is generated through sociogenesis. He says, through others we become ourselves. And this rule refers not only to the individual, but to the history of each separate function. The higher psychological functions do not arise in social relations. They arise as social relations. That is, the environment is where the mind comes from. The environment, in a sense, is simultaneously social and psychological. That's where Vygotsky says you have to look. So sociocultural theory is actually a psychological, psycholinguistic theory. It's not a sociolinguistic or social theory. But we're just looking in a different place. Okay? So this is a summary of what I just said. So our intrapsychological plane then is the result of internalized social relations that largely come about as a consequence of speaking and acting. So our attention then is voluntary. We can decide what we want to pay attention to. We still have our instincts so that if we see a bright light or hear a loud sound, we turn to it. We're startled. But we can logically, voluntarily pay attention to certain things, as when, for example, you're taking a course and you want to study for an exam or you want to write a research paper, you pay attention to certain things and you ignore other things. That's an intentional act. The same thing with memory. We can control and organize our memory in specific ways, using things like paper and pencil to take notes, or our iPhones to remind us that we have a lecture to give, even though I put it on my phone at the wrong time, but it still was an attempt to control my memory through a humanly created artifact. The same thing with concepts, the same thing with mediated perception, thinking, and so on. So another way to think about this is that if you look at the bottom, the dotted line, the relationship between the person and the world is our biological connection. That's what we share with animals. Animals have that direct connection. But our human connection with the world is the tip of the triangle, the solid lines, where our mind is a result of mediation that comes to us through our social activities, through our artifacts, through our concepts, right? So what is first social then becomes, in a sense, psychological. And this liberates us from the concrete situation. Children, before they have language, are very much controlled by their immediate environment. It's very difficult for children to think about the future and talk about the future, or think about the past and talk about the past. Children, up until they begin to develop language, can only think and interact with the here and now. But adults can sit in a room in their home and they can think about what happened to them 5 years ago, 10 years ago. They can think about what they would like to happen to them in the future. And you can think about what's going on anywhere in the world. Children can't do that. And it's language that gives our mind that capacity. Okay, so if we go back to the task of cognitive SLA, as Dowdy and Long point out, SLA, as second language studies, engages in basic research without regard to applications. It identifies the nature and source of underlying L2 knowledge system. It explains developmental success or failure. It tests divergent theories. It establishes relationships. It looks at the relationship between language and thought, where and how the brain stores and retrieves linguistic knowledge, the brain's adaptation to multilingualism and aphasia. Well, it turns out that sociocultural theory does exactly the same thing. It identifies the source and nature of our knowledge system, which is not the head, it's the social world. It explains developmental success or failure because it comes about as a result of changes in the social environment, which affects our success or failure. the classroom is a different site for development than is an immersion setting. The mechanism of development is imitation of the ideal as a creative transformative process. So the ideal, and by ideal here, I don't mean a Platonic ideal. I mean what humans have created and made available in culture as we've humanized the world becomes available to children, and it's passed on to the children by the caretakers, usually their parents, other adults, their older siblings, their friends, their playmates, right? And it's a transformative process. Imitation is not a copying like a parrot would do. It's a transformative process. So children acquire the culture, which leads to the development of their mind as a consequence of imitating, that is, trying to engage in the activities that they see around them. But that process is transformative. That is, each time a child appropriates something from the culture, something from the society, it becomes slightly different, right? It's a transformative process. Sociocultural theory is interested. I have a lot more to say about that, but I don't have time right now. So sociocultural theory is the relationship between language. It looks at the relationship between language and thought. So, for example, one of the really interesting questions that we've been asking in the sociocultural research on SLA is the ultimate attainment question. Now, if you're familiar with what's going on in the UG field, they frame the ultimate attainment question in terms of how much like a native speaker, how much native-like knowledge can a second language learner acquire about the grammar of the language? The way we would frame that ultimate attainment question is whether or not a person can use the L2 to mediate their own thinking. So that acquiring a second language is not just about being able to communicate socially. It's about how far can you use this new system to think? Does it affect, for example, how you think about your emotions? Does it affect your memory? Does it affect your perception? Because we're talking about acquiring a new conceptual system. And that system potentially can have an impact on our psychology. So the question then becomes is, can people use the second language to mediate their thinking? And there's some really interesting research that we've been doing recently, some of which says you can, and some of which says it's really hard. Okay? And Vygotsky asked this question in 1928, right? Some people see this as a new question. It's actually an old question. One of Illyria's students, who published a chapter in our handbook of sociocultural theory and second language development, in fact, specifically investigates the topic on the mind, how learning a second language might actually restructure not just the mind, but the brain, in looking at the neuroscience of multilinguals. That's a really interesting issue. What happens to the mind of multilingual individuals, and what happens to the brain of multilingual individuals, right? This goes back to the work of Luria in the working brain. So then, sociocultural theory is not a social theory. It's a psychological theory of higher human mental functions. It traces the origin of consciousness of mind to human culture and social material activity. It looks to the world, not the brain. It looks outside to find the mind. It's interested in understanding the relationship between the humanized world and the human brain, which is what gives rise to the mind. It argues that mechanisms of development are situated in the culture, in the social world, not in the brain. Right? So it's a psychological theory, but it looks not inside the head, it looks inside the world to find the origins of the mind. Sociocultural theories argues that the mind is the result of the appropriation and internalization of social interaction about the world. The mind emerges from social interaction, penetrating the biological organ, that is the brain. So you need a brain. You can't become a human mind without a brain. But a brain does not give you a human mind. You need a human culture. You need a human society. We need a humanized world, right? And so the research of some of my students over the years has shown that the way language acquisition unfolds in tutored settings, like classrooms, is a very different process from the way it unfolds in immersion settings. So these so-called natural sequences are not a universal phenomenon that happens everywhere, as Long argues, because they can be shaped and reshaped by implementing particular kinds of pedagogical practices, right? So the conclusion then is that as a general psychological theory, sociocultural theory addresses human development in the everyday world and in the schools world. It looks at mental functioning. It looks at human and animal differences. It looks at historical development of societies. Different societies think in different ways. Luria and Vygotsky did some really interesting work in this regard among some of the tribal communities or the rural communities in the old Soviet Union. And they found that there were significant differences in the way people thought if they had been to school as opposed to if they had not been to school. So people who hadn't been to school had a very hard time thinking categorically, taxonomically. They tended to think functionally. Language and the brain, once language penetrates, Vygotsky shows that, and Luria, once language penetrates the brain, it restructures the brain into a very different kind of system. It's interested in pathological behaviors. So Vygotsky was very interested in studying schizophrenia and aphasia and the cognition of children who have been abandoned and living on the streets. He found that they thought in a very different way from people who had been raised in a so-called normal, natural kind of environment. He was interested in multilingualism, as I pointed out. What is the difference between a multilingual person and a monolingual person psychologically, right? And our contribution has been to the domain of second language acquisition, right? We're interested in the process of second language acquisition in different kinds of settings, in different cultures, in different social environments, under different kinds of instruction, with different purposes, at different ages, right? And what are the effects of this on the mind, not just on social communication, but also on the mental activity of the individuals who acquire second languages, both early in life and late in life. So that's my presentation.
Okay.
I'm happy to answer questions, or I hope you were able to follow along. I'm terribly sorry that things were so confusing because
No
of the
problem.
slides, but I think we got through it.
Professor Lantold, it couldn't be better than this. It was wonderful, very comprehensive, very informative, very insightful. As a norm in previous sessions, I was preparing a note, a synopsis of the, let's say, main speaker's talk, and I was giving that summary to the people who just joined us during the talk. But because today we are pressed for time, I think we had better allocate its time for Q&A. Now the floor is open for Q&A. So you can just put in your questions in the chat box, or you can just click on the raised hand sign. I will activate your mic and you can directly talk to the professor.
I see two raised hands.
Okay. Mr. Rahimzadeh. Mr. Jafari, Mr. or Ms. Jafari.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. It's a great honor to listen to you, Dr. Lankov. And my question is, how is social cultural theory different from semiotic ecological theory or activity theory? That's it.
Okay. So let me answer the issue about activity theory. Activity theory, it's a complex issue. Activity theory was actually initiated by Vygotsky, but it took a kind of unanticipated turn during the 1930s under the directorship of Alexei Leontiev. Now, Vygotsky argued that that the mind is formed through the internalization of semiotic means, semiotic forms of mediation, largely through the signs that we create in language, but in the process of engaging in practical activity. So for Vygotsky, the unit of analysis, what was to be explained, was the human mind, the formation of the human mind, through the integration of the biological and the social in complex activity. So the activity was the explanatory principle, right? The unit of analysis that you analyzed was language in the service of that activity. What happened with activity theory was they took language largely out of the picture and they focused on activity not only as the unit of analysis, but as the explanatory principle. And that leads you in a circular, as Vygotsky criticized it actually, in a circular way of doing things. So what you're trying to explain is activity, and how you're trying to explain it is through activity. And that leads you into a circular kind of argumentation. And Vygotsky says what you're trying to explain is the human mind and how it's formed through semiotic systems. And the explanatory principle was as those systems interact in practical activity, right? And so that's the problem. There's no real place for language as the unit of analysis that is thinking and speaking unified in language in activity theory. And so that I think is a problem. Now, I think activity theory is really important because it makes a lot of sense, at least Leontiev's version. I think Engström is slightly different. But I think Leontiev's theory of activity is really appealing because it brings in the whole notion of purpose and the conditions under which people act. But it leaves out the crucial aspect of how that external activity becomes internalized because it doesn't assign a central place to language. And that's what Vygotsky was cautioning against. And that's what he criticized Leontiev for.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sure.
آقای دکتر Professor Alavi from the University of Tehran, please.
Okay.
James, it's really an honor to listen to you. It reminds
Thank you
me
very much.
all the talk of Jeff Leach, Deco Wright, and other big names in Lancaster University in UK. So I did hear about you and your expertise, but I didn't have a chance to listen to you. Hopefully, I have a chance now to raise one of my major problems, because when we talk about interactionism, in general we have cognitive processes, social processes, motivational processes, intentional processes, developmental processes. Is it possible for you to talk about the centrality or the hierarchical development or these processes and the emergence of the sign of development of these processes, especially in classroom context, when we actually look at a particular task design or feedback or evaluation of responses or processes or products? And you appreciate your elaboration on these issues.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a really important question. The first thing is we have to keep in mind that Vygotsky was proposing a general theory of psychology. He wasn't proposing a theory of language acquisition. He wasn't proposing a theory of emotional development. He was proposing a theory of what it means to be a human being. And consequently, if you read the body of work that he left behind, and of course we all know that he died very early from tuberculosis and he never finished his work, and that's one of the interesting topics that that's why people are now debating heavily what he meant by different concepts. But he was trying to understand, he was trying to propose a theory that would account for the development of what he called the human personality. And that meant it had to not only account for the mental, that is what we normally think of as cognitive, but it also had to consider the emotional, the creative, the imagination, motivation, right? Everything that makes humans unique and different from all other forms of life. So he has written extensively. He has a really interesting series of papers on creativity and imagination in school, and I encourage you to read that. I just recently finished a paper on what's called motivational dialogue. And this I find extremely appealing, and I'm hoping that people will begin to work on this. Motivational dialogue is, in a sense, the dialogue that we engage in with others, our teachers, our parents, our friends, as well as with ourselves, that sort of sets in motion what it is we want to achieve, whether that is learning a second language, whether it is learning mathematics, whether it's learning how to cook, whether it's learning how to be a carpenter, whatever that is, that just doesn't come out of thin air. It comes as a consequence of these dialogues that we engage in with other people. One of the problems that we encounter in schools, in classrooms, is we don't often open up enough space for teachers and learners to engage in motivational dialogues. We just assume that students are either motivated or not motivated, and then we go on about our teaching. And the motivated students will learn, those that are not motivated won't. But Vygotsky says what has to happen is teachers have to be part of that motivational process. We have other kinds of dialogues that we engage in classrooms. We have informational dialogues. We have behavioral dialogues, right, where we try to keep the students focused and under control. But we have very little space for these motivational dialogues. And I find this a really interesting topic. The other topic that Vygotsky sort of wrote about that people are really fascinated by now is this dialectic relationship between the intellect, between cognition and emotion. And sort of a few of the final papers that he wrote before he died were focused on this new dialectic, which in Russian, the Russian term, there's not a good English term for it. The Russian term is переживание, which is this unity of the emotional side of our consciousness and the intellectual side of our consciousness. And people are writing more and more about this now. There are several books that have come out about this topic. Because Vygotsky says we only act out of emotion, right? It's emotion. It's when we experience a disequilibrium or a dissonance between ourselves, our personality, and what's coming at us from the world. And that creates a kind of imbalance. And that's emotional, right? So when the world doesn't fit with our current way of thinking about it, we have a problem. And that often creates an emotional reaction to it, right? And then we bring our intellect into the picture to try to resolve that emotional imbalance, right? Whether it's positive or negative. So we try to do something about it. We try to, whereas children have a hard time doing that. Children react almost purely emotionally because they don't have a fully formed intellect. And it's hard for children to control their emotions. It's easier for adults to do that to our intellect, right? We're supposed to behave in certain ways in certain settings. We don't throw ourselves on the floor and hold our breath and stamp and yell and scream in a public place, right? That's not an adult behavior, but children often do that. We don't do that because we can tell ourselves, even though maybe we're emotional, we can control it through our intellect. Now, sometimes it gets out of control and then we have real problems and people can, go off the deep end, as we say, and they have psychological issues. So these are some of what you raised are really interesting topics. And the theory is a theory that's designed to account for all aspects of what it means to be a human being. And that includes emotions as well as cognition, motivation, etc.
Hello, Professor. Do you have my voice?
Yes, I do.
First of all, thank you so much for your insightful presentation. I really enjoyed it. Actually, my question is, when it comes to this interactionist perspective and sorting through the input, as Vygotsky mainly mentioned, or Susan Gast or other scholars, my question is how we can make the boundary between inhibitory control, which comes with a working memory capacity, and selective attention. These two are actually sort of tricky for me to distinguish between them, and for long I just thought maybe they have different labels with the same function. Yes, this is my question, how I can make a distinction between these two, because I think that this inhibitory control may be the one that leads to awareness regarding human beings and social planning and logic memory, but selective attention do the same too. So this boundary and distinction is a question for me, and I would be so much grateful if you inform me about this distinction.
Okay, so the question is the distinction between inhibitory control and working
And
memory?
selective attention.
Okay. We know that one of the things that we cannot do with our cognition is to pay attention to everything, right? You have to focus on certain things in the environment, right? And so to do that, you have to inhibit yourself from acting to begin with, right? So one of the things that animals have a hard time doing is inhibiting themselves from acting. So when an animal is hungry, it starts to hunt for food. It doesn't It doesn't say, well, I'll wait a couple of hours before I eat, which is what we can do, right? We can decide that we'll wait because I have to study for a test. We can decide what it is we want to eat. We can decide when we want to eat, right? But to do that, you have to inhibit yourself from acting. And that's the role that your intellect plays, right? So being hungry is, in a sense, a kind of emotional reaction to a bodily function, to a bodily need. Now, one of the interesting problems that we've been working on recently is the problem of working memory. One of the things that we know, or we seem to know, is that working memory, people with low working memory span, particularly the phonological loop, have a hard time learning languages. One of my students did a dissertation a few years ago, and we published a paper on this in the book on Instructed Second Language Learning by Sado and Sean Lowen. We found that there was a student studying Chinese as a second language who had a very low working memory capacity. Her phonological loop in Chinese and in English was extremely low. And the prediction was that she should have been a really bad language learner. But it turned out that she was one of the best learners in the class. And we couldn't figure out why that was until we recognized that one of the things she did, and this goes to the whole issue of mediation, right? And this is a crucial feature of Vygotsky's theory. People who have certain kinds of, we'll call them deficits for lack of a better term right now, whether they be biological or whether they be cultural or social, that is deprived of access to certain kinds of knowledge, can overcome these if you can provide them with the right kinds of mediation. What we discovered was that this student who had been in class with my student, his name is Sean, we'll call him Sean, he used the silent way rods, if you know those little colored rods of different shapes that was used in silent way. It's also used, Cuisinart rods, it's also used for teaching mathematics to children. He used them to teach the concept of Chinese word order. So how you manipulate the rods with your hands. He was showing that that's how you can change around the grammar, the language, Chinese, to use different word orders to change meanings, which English doesn't do very well. We discovered that when she was speaking Chinese, she was moving her hands as if she were actually manipulating the rods, but there were no rods there. So she was virtually manipulating the rods. She had internalized the concept of using these little sticks, these little rods, and she used this to compensate for the fact that she had a low memory span, a low phonological loop, and that allowed her to overcome what would otherwise be a deficit. And she turned out to be as good a speaker of Chinese as most of the students in the class, and better than some, right, who had a much better working memory. So the lesson of this is, as Vygotsky says, everybody has the capacity to develop. The problem is that in most of our educational systems, we tend to focus on the normal way of doing things. And the normal way is based on what most people can do, right? The problem is not everybody can do what's normal. And the challenge for pedagogy is to develop ways to help people who can't do what's normal, right? So most cultures are set up that way. You know, just to take a simple example, most people are right-handed. So most of the world is organized in a way to privilege right-handedness. And it's difficult to be a left-hander in that world, right? Playing a violin, for example, right? You hold it like this, but if you're a left-hander, you have to hold it the other way. The hearing versus being deaf, right? Most of the people in the world are hearing. So the world is set up based heavily on sound systems, on sound language, being, spoken language being part of that. But people who are deaf have to find another way of mediating themselves, right? And that's through visual language. So Vygotsky says the challenge and the responsibility of psychology is to find ways of remediating people so they can maximally develop to whatever their capacity may be, rather than just assuming that they can't develop at all, right? And so here we find a case of a student with a low working memory capacity that, in point of fact, found a way to overcome that through the pedagogy that she had experienced, and she managed to learn Chinese quite well, right? So I hope that's partially an answer to your question.
It was really great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, before we move on to the next question, I was going to ask you about the meaning of crisis, the crisis in the title. In Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, he expounds, extensively about this term, crisis in science. He argues when the current paradigm, the advocates of a current paradigm, they feel some sort of problem with responding to the newly emerging questions. That becomes the existential philosophy for creating a new paradigm. So I was wondering about the connotation of this crisis in your title, because for the past, let's say, 3 decades, both sociocognitive and sociocultural, let's say linguistic cognitive and sociocultural, these two paradigms, although they are ontologically contradictory, they have been, let's say, evolving in a parallel fashion. So is it, I don't know, can we say we are facing a kind of crisis? Because as I said, crisis is when the existing paradigm fails to respond to the new questions emerging in a, let's say, in a field in question.
Right. Yeah, that's true. That's what Kuhn says. But that's a different kind of crisis. I think our crisis, what I'm trying to say is, based following Vygotsky's view, that our crisis is in some sense deeper than the crisis that Kuhn is talking about. Because what we're talking about here is an ontological and epistemological crisis, right? And it's created, among other things, by the fact that we have these multiple theories. We have at least 18 different theories. And everybody is, in a sense, doing normal science within their theory, right? So you have 18 different people doing normal science without paying attention to what the other people are doing in their theories, right, as normal science. And yet, and this relates to the other topic that I see as a crisis, which is the relationship between theory, research, and practice. So what are we supposed to say to teachers when you have 18 different ways of conceptualizing the process of acquiring a second language? So UG says certain things that are radically different from what sociocultural theory says, right? And Vygotsky faced the same crisis at his time in psychology. There were multiple psychological theories operating at the time, but they could be distilled into 2 theories. Basically, an idealist theory that is a Freudian kind of theory, and a materialist theory, which is basically behaviorism, right? Which says that the mind. So in an idealist theory, it's basically a Kantian Platonic view that says, everything is contained in the mind brain from birth, and it just emerges as you mature, as you age. The behaviorist theories say, whether it's Pavlov or whether it's American Anglo behaviorism, those theories say your mind is formed on the basis of what goes on in the world, right? And so there is no starting point. It's the blank slate kind of thing, right? And what I think is happening in SLA is we have these multiple theories, some of which are cognitive and some of which are social. right? So the difference is similar to what Vygotsky was looking at. We have social theories and we have so-called cognitive theories. The problem is that the cognitive theories don't pay any attention to the mechanisms of the social for the formation of mind, and the social theories overlook the cognitive in the formation of mind, right? So I don't think sociocognitive is anywhere similar to sociocultural. I don't think at all. I think the fact that it's hyphenated tells you that there's a problem, right? Vygotsky, one of the terms that Vygotsky used to describe psychological development was cultural development. He didn't make any distinction between cultural development and psychological development. For him, they were the same thing, because the psychology comes from what's in the world, from the humanized world, right? And so what I'm trying to argue is that maybe one of the ways of overcoming this dualism of the social and the cognitive is to consider what Vygotsky had to say, that the social matters, but it's the social that's the origin of the cognitive. In a sense, there is no cognitive, there is no human cognitive without the human social, right? That's the point. And so we have this crisis of what do we do with these two systems, cognitive and social, and we have various solutions. One is to ignore each other. The other one is to do what Lourdes Ortega is arguing for. We have a multidisciplinary system. We have a lot of different theories, and that's okay. The other one is to do what Nick Ellis is saying, look in both directions quickly, but you still have to look in two directions. Vygotsky is saying you look in one direction, and the direction you look in is the social. That's where you have to look to find the human mind, right?
Mm-hmm. But don't you think?
And so that's the great.
But don't you think that way, is not complicating the researching process? I mean, when you see it in the framework of Cartesian reductionism or Cartesian dualism, you are breaking one, let's say, phenomenon into the constituent blocks, parts. So maybe, under the current status of, let's say, scientific development, maybe it becomes more amenable to study research-wise. But when you see it, as Vygotsky says, you see it as a whole. Don't you think it makes it more complex, more difficult to investigate research-wise?
Actually not. What Vygotsky says is you have, and this is why Vygotsky, before he even proposed his theory, he laid down a methodology for how you should be doing research about human psychological development. And the crucial thing that he says is you have to pick the right unit of analysis for what you want to look at. So if you want to look at, let's say, the cognitive development of the person, just the purely cognitive, right? So he recognizes you can't look at the whole person at once. It's just, as you say, too complex. But if you want to look at, let's just say the cognitive side, then then your unit of analysis is going to be, for him, it was the spoken word. Because in the spoken word, what you see is the unity of thinking and speaking. And he says that when you think, you speak, and when you speak, you think. This is what children have to discover about how to behave as a human being. Children, before they acquire language, they think, but they don't think in a human way, only human way, because they don't have a language through which they can think. And so, if you want to look at that side, then your unit of analysis is the spoken word. If you want to understand the emotional side, then your unit of analysis is this perejivanie, which is how the human responds to emotional situations in the environment, right? So you have to tailor the unit of analysis to what it is you're interested in studying. right? Um, that's the point. That's his argument. So and you can't reduce it. He says you can't reduce it to the elements. So if all you want to study is perception, then you're not studying the human mind anymore. You're studying an element of the human mind. But he says what you have to study is the unit, right? And the example that he often gives is if you want to understand how it is that the properties of water put out fire, you can't study oxygen and hydrogen separately. You have to study oxygen and hydrogen together as a unit. Because if you study them separately, you can't explain how they can put out fire. Because one burns and the other one foments burning, right? So you can't do that. You have to look at the right unit, right?
Nice analogy.
I think it is. Yeah, I think it is a good one.
Okay,
right?
thanks.
So Vygotsky was all about trying to find the right unit to analyze the aspects of the human personality, right? And that was the key to him, to his methodology.
Okay, thank you so much. So I don't know how many questions can we take, Prof? One or two?
I'm happy to.
It's up to you.
I'm happy to take.
Because we don't want to.
No, I'm fine. I apologize for starting late, so I'm happy to answer all the questions that people ask.
Not at all.
Or try to answer.
Not at all. Okay, Ms. Tawakkoli.
Hello, Professor. Can you hear
Hello?
me?
Yes, I can.
All right. Well, before I ask my question, I would like to thank you for this lecture, for being with us, taking the time. Thank you so very much. Talking to you is just a dream come true. All right. Now, my question. Well, according to what you said, Vygotsky resolved the crisis in psychology between nurture and nature, positing that higher order cognitive functions, they emerge out of mediated interaction of people with the world. So according to what he argued, all higher order cognitive functions, they have social origins. And then you brought the example of two people learning, and you said that if they are learning in different contexts, then the learning would be different, right? Now, imagine that we have two learners. They are learning in the same context with the same teacher, the same setting. The only factor that is different is that one of them knows only one language, is monolingual, and the other one has already learned another language. Now here, we know even before the instruction and mediation start, we already know that these two learners are going to go through different learning trajectories, different learning paths.
Right.
So here is what I get confused. Doesn't it take us back to the cognitive again? Shouldn't we just look at the cognitive side? Because what is different between these learners is what internal cognitive resources they have available. Right. So that's where I get confused.
Okay, that's a very good question. So here's how Vygotsky deals with that. He says we have to make a distinction between the objective social situation, which in the case you posit is the same for both learners. Objectively, if you were to be a third party looking at this particular classroom, it would look like it's the same environment. But he says what we have to worry about is how that environment is refracted, not reflected, but refracted through the individual, through the personality, that is, through the person's history. Right? So everybody comes to a particular situation with a different history, with a different consciousness, with a different psychological, with a different personality is the term that he uses, right? So you have to look at the subjective situation as well. And that's what he calls the social situation of development. So he makes this distinction between the social situation, the objective situation, and the subjective situation, which is the social situation of development. And there you have to worry about not just whether somebody's learned another language before, but you have to worry about motivation. You have to worry about the purpose and the goal that people have for studying the language.
Right.
or whatever it is they're studying, right? You have to worry about all of that, and that's a function of their histories. And so you have to look at what we call the pre-understanding, that is, what the starting point is, right? We just sort of assume that everybody's starting from the same place. Well, they're not. They're starting from different places. You have to know what they understand already, not only about the target language, but about language in general. You have to understand their goals, their purpose, and so on. He gives a nice example to show this. He gives an example of a real situation that they dealt with in their laboratory, which was 3 children, a 13-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 4-year-old, who were being raised by an abusive parent. It was a mother who was an alcoholic, and she was abusive to the children when she would drink. And so it's the same objective environment. You have a home life that's not conducive to the best forms of development for these children. But each one of the children reacted differently to that very same environment, right? The young child treated the mother with what was called a hexa complex, or a witch complex. There was a love-hate relationship between the mother and the child. So he was afraid of her, but he also loved her, and he liked being with her, right? So you had this really weird kind of relationship. The older child had a more mature way of dealing with this. He treated himself as if he were actually the missing father, and he fathered the younger children to help them deal with the situation that was created by the mother when she became abusive, and so on, right? So what you end up with is a completely different kind of emotional reaction to the very same situation, and there's no reason to assume that wouldn't play out in a classroom, right?
Sure.
So yes, you're quite right to say what you said, yeah. But Vygotsky's explanation for that is exactly what I just said. It depends on your previous history and your personality, how you're going to react to that same situation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And he was so much influenced by historical materialism. I'm sure that would be the same answer he would have given. Thank you so very much.
Sure. You're very welcome.
Thank you. Okay, the next one, Mr. Haksefili.
All right. Could you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right. Dear Professor Lantolf, I'd like to thank you very much for joining this conversation. Well, my question is far more fundamental than the topic of this discussion. My question is that, is it not the time to move from sticking to psychological theories, or, for example, Larsen Freeman being so excited about the complexity theory and trying to answer all SLA questions through complexity theory? What if we created SLA-specific theories? In this regard, we will not have to deal with several complexities of forcibly trying to place the non-SLA theory in SLA domain.
Okay, that's a good question. So, if you go back into the history of SLA, you will find that originally people were trying, and I would say most of the theories that emerged in the early days, like Krashen and Schumann and Long's variation on Krashen, and so on, were largely theories developed to explain SLA and only SLA. They weren't attempts to explain other psychological phenomena. The reason why we became interested in Vygotsky was that Vygotsky was proposing a general theory of psychology. That is, basically, his theory was an attempt to explain everything that makes humans unique, separate from all other forms of life. And if that's true, then the theory should have something to say about second language acquisition and multilingualism. And it does, right? So it seems to me that And so what you get from that way of thinking about it is actually a more powerful theoretical position, because the theory accounts for SLA and so much more. It doesn't just account for SLA. So that makes it, in my view, a far more powerful theory. Now, as far as complex dynamic systems theory goes, and I've had long discussions with Diane and other people who espouse this theory, and I've read as much as I can about the theory, and I don't pretend to be an expert in it, but I've read quite a bit about it. I'm uncomfortable with the attempt to try to subsume Vygotskian theory, sociocultural theory, within complex dynamic systems theory for a number of reasons. One of which is, and this goes back even to Vygotsky's arguments, that complex dynamic systems theory was developed to try to explain how the non-human world functions. That is, the inert world of things like planetary motion, weather systems, in the biological world of plant growth and so on, and even the animal world, and then was transferred into the human world. And then, which to me is a problem to begin with, right? And then there's this attempt to try to explain language itself as a complex dynamic system, as an adaptive system. The problem with that, to me, is that language is a tool for thinking. And for
Prof, sound is breaking.
Oh, sorry. How about now? Is it better? If
I think you need to log out and log in again.
You want me to log out?
I think you need to log out and log in again.
Okay.
Sorry. Hello?
Hello? Hello?
Yes, we can see you and we can hear you.
Okay.
Okay.
So let me complete my answer to that question. I think the problem that I see with complex dynamic systems is that it's hard to imagine that language as a tool is an adaptive system, because you can't imagine, for example, a tool like a hammer or a knife or a saw as an adaptive system. It's humans that change it. So why would language be any different? So to me, language is a complex, adaptable system that we change to meet our communicative and psychological needs and purposes. It's not an adaptive system. It can't do anything without people manipulating it. I think at the macro level, broad lens, I think you might be able to say something about humans from a complex dynamic system perspective. But I think from a more micro level, when you deal with individuals or smaller groups of individuals where things like agency come into play and purpose and goal come into play, I think it gets very difficult because, there's no agency in the inert world. And complex dynamic systems was developed to deal with that kind of reality. And Vygotsky says one of the dangers when he was trying to deal with the crisis is one of the dangers was that psychology at the time was trying to adapt principles and assumptions that were developed in the hard sciences, including the research methodology, as well as the ontology. And he says it's really hard to transfer something that was developed for studying another reality like planetary motion or plant growth and bring that into the study of human personality. He said you have to develop your own methodology and you have to develop your own ontology. And so I have problems with complex dynamic systems on that level, especially when they try to subsume sociocultural theory within their framework. I think that's a non-starter. I think that's a real problem.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we can take one or two more questions.
Sure.
Okay, Ms. Dinani. Ms. Dinani, Mr. Alizadeh.
Hello, dear Professor.
Hello?
Do you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Dear Professor, I much appreciate your favor. It's a great honor to be here. Let me please ask my question briefly. There is a vague issue to some extent far from the discussed topics. I would be thankful if the dear professor answered it. As you know, explicit and implicit learning have been discussed both in cognitive psychology and in SLA. My question is this. What are the roles of explicit and implicit learning in SLA? One should or can help one of them or both of them together. Thank you.
Right. The answer that I would give was a dialectical answer, which means that both of them are necessary. But both of them depend, which one you deploy depends on the developmental trajectory or developmental level of the learner. And so now what we're talking about is Vygotsky's concept of the zone of proximal development. So the question then becomes not which one is better or which is more effective, implicit or explicit learning or implicit instruction or explicit implicit knowledge. It's that both are potentially necessary depending on the developmental level of the learner. So some learners require, depending on what it is they're trying to learn and what their system is like, some learners require very explicit instruction, very explicit input or knowledge, and some learners can require only a very marginal kind of hint to be able to respond and to develop. So our argument has always been that both forms of learning and both forms of instruction are necessary depending on the student's zone of proximal development. You can't make a judgment on this beforehand.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much, dear Professor.
Sure.
Okay,
Sure.
and Mr. Alipour.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you, Dr. Lantel, Professor Lantel, for this informative talk. Actually, my question concerns the part where you talked about a claim made by the sociocultural theory. I think it was toward the end of the talk. You pointed out to the idea that actually the theory posits that culture is heterogeneous, that basically people living in different parts of the world might actually experience different kinds of culture and might actually see the world or tend to see the world through different lenses. My question is, how would the sociocultural theory account for the ever-increasing homogeneity that we are witnessing across cultures these days? Maybe, I don't know, because of the process of globalization or linguistic imperialism or whatever other cause it might actually be linked to. Given that it's actually, it has put a great emphasis on cultural development. And how would the theory account for that?
Okay, that's a good question. So the theory is saying that your psychology depends on the cultural forms of mediation that you have access to. So if you don't have access to, for example, if you don't have access to literacy, you're going to think in a very different way about the world than if you do have access to literacy. right? Many years ago, I was involved in a project in Bolivia where the government was trying to bring schooling into the indigenous communities. The speakers of Aymara, Quechua, and Guarani, 3 of the indigenous languages, because these communities were being abused and suppressed by the dominance of the Spanish-speaking literate community in Bolivia. And so one of the things they wanted to do was to introduce schooling and literacy into the community. Now, one of the problems that they confronted was as soon as you introduce literacy into a community, you change the way that community thinks about the world. And if you want to read more about this, I suggest 2 wonderful books by David Olson, who was a professor at the University of Toronto. One book is called The Mind on Paper, and the other one is called The World on Paper. And what he shows is that cultures, as soon as literacy is introduced into a culture, their way of thinking changes. And this is what Vygotsky found in his study of the Uzbek population in rural, the Central Soviet republics in rural Asia, that once they introduced schooling, the way that they thought changed radically. And this study has been replicated among the Eskimo populations of Canada and Alaska, in other parts of the world, right? It just happens that way. People who have literacy think differently. Now, as the world becomes globalized, largely through technology, then you would expect that cultures begin to change. And if cultures begin to change, then the psychology of those people who are of children who are brought into the cultures will begin to change. That's totally predictable by the theory, right? Now, how they change is going to be a function of what happens to the culture, right? So let's just assume that one day everybody started speaking the same language, whatever language that is. All 4 billion or 4.5 billion people in the world started to speak language X all of a sudden, right? What you would expect from a sociocultural perspective is that people would begin to think in the same way, because that
Not
system that they use
necessarily
for
the
thinking
exact
is
same
the
way,
same
but very
system.
simple ways, right?
Yeah, sure. And also you have to remember,
Across relatives, people living in a different in a single city might actually exhibit a wide range of cultural differences, depending
yes,
on
you're quite right.
historicity, as you pointed out a little earlier, depending on what has
Yes,
actually happened to them during the course of their
yes,
lives.
that's correct. That's correct. And so what you see in this country, for example, is massive social class differences, because this country is completely stratified, right? There's massive differences between the upper and the wealthy classes and the working and the poor classes, and even in terms of things like access to schooling. And the languages, they all speak English, but they're not speaking the same English, right?
So
And
language
so
is not
what
a
that
single
means is,
determinant, because we have been talking about language being a medium of
yeah,
culture, a medium through which culture is actually,
yeah,
transferred from generation to generation, or from family members to,
yeah,
other people. But here, the point you're actually making kind of like negates the idea that language is the byproduct of these cultural transmissions and cultural interactions.
actually no, because remember, language is not a monolithic thing. So English spoken in
Dynamic.
my hometown is not the same English that's spoken in Los Angeles. It's a different English, right? And so the English that's spoken in different social classes is a different English. The
It's
English
not
that's
about
spoken
the
in
language,
Australia
it's
is a
about the
different English.
idiosyncratic differences across different types of languages that people might actually adopt. It's not
Yeah, but
about the single language per se, but rather about the tiny, teeny little differences we might find in the language that people produce.
yeah, but
Is that right?
those differences are not tiny teeny, because what we're not talking about the structure of the language. We're talking about the semantics of the language, right? So if you have different vocabulary, or your lexicon has different meanings, then you're going to think differently. One of the important distinctions that Vygotsky made was between the language of the community and the personal language of the individual. And he says there's a dialectic, there's a clash here, because the language of the community may not offer me the options to express the meanings that I want to express. And so what I have to do is to reshape that language. That's why I think language is a complex, adaptable system. I might have to reshape that language to express the meanings that I want to express. My own personal way of speaking
come up
that
with
language
like
matters.
an idiolect. Is that what they
Yes,
call it?
that's what. Right, that's what Vygotsky called private speech, right? So there's this distinction between private or egocentric speech and social speech. That the kind of meanings that you find in a dictionary versus the kind of meanings that I create when I'm in the act of communicating with somebody, in the act of thinking to communicate with somebody. So that we can't assume that English is a unified monolithic language. It just isn't, right? Any more than Farsi is a unified monolithic language. No language is like that.
Thank
right?
you very much.
Unless it's spoken by maybe three people, right? But
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Very informative.
okay, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, with due respect to your request about just putting more questions to Professor Lantolf, I'm afraid to say that Professor is already tired, I'm sure, after a lengthy speech and responding to many questions. If, I don't know, shall we?
I'm happy to entertain one or two more questions.
Okay.
I'm happy to do one or two more.
Two more questions. Okay.
Okay.
Mr. Qane. Ms. Mehdipour.
Dear Professor Lantolf, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Lantolf and dear Mr. Moderator. As you're totally aware, these days we are dealing with a kind of pandemic around the world, and most of the classes are being held online. So we do not have that much of a realistic or lifelike, interaction between the teachers and the students, right? To be brief, can we really just assert that there is a higher tendency for cognitive theories nowadays in comparison with the socio-behavioral theories?
I can't hear him.
Shall I repeat myself?
Yes, please. He broke up.
Yes, my question actually was this one, that can we assert that nowadays there is a higher tendency for cognitive theories rather than socio-behavioral theories?
That's your question. Okay.
Yeah.
So let me say this. I think that depends where in the world you are. I think, let me answer it this way. I think one of the problems with sort of Anglo-American research has been the tendency to engage in what Vygotsky would call vulgar materialism. That is, to assume somehow that the mind and the brain are the same thing, and that the key to consciousness is to look inside the brain. That's what I would call cognitive neuroscience, right? So in this country, there's a lot of research using things like fMRI, ERP studies, right? Trying to figure out where in the brain consciousness is located. But interestingly, there are now beginning to emerge some leading cognitive neuroscientists that think that consciousness might in fact be a consequence of our social circumstances, basically discovering what Vygotsky discovered almost 100 years ago. And you're finding more and more this guy named Koch, K-O-C-H, is one of the leading proponents of the argument that consciousness is really a consequence of our social world as it penetrates the brain. And so they're beginning to realize that maybe they are looking in the wrong place. Maybe we have to look into the world to find consciousness, or at least the origins of consciousness. And it's not something that's buried deep inside the brain that emerges as the brain matures. So I'm not so sure that, I still think within American psychology and Western psychology, cognitive psychology is the dominant view. There's no question about that. But slowly, I think people are beginning to realize that the social and the cultural are really important places to begin to look for the origins of consciousness, because you're not going to find it inside the brain. It's just not there.
All right. So you mean that we shall just, keep up with the combination of both of these kind of, theories that they're existing nowadays, because one way or the other, we have to have the combination of both, as you mentioned.
Yeah, but I don't think they can be separate theories. I think you can't just have a cognitive theory and a social theory. You have to find a way of putting them together, which is what I'm arguing for. They need to be integrated into a unified theory.
Good. Thank you very much, dear Professor. Thanks a lot for your fruitful answers.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
Okay, so do one more?
Yes, Dr. Ramazani. Dr. Ramazani? You're not around?
I am. I don't know what to do. Is my voice coming through okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
It's a great pleasure, Professor Lantov, to be here and to listen to your marvelous and inspiring and beautiful speech. And I hope that one day we host you in Tabriz, the beautiful city of Tabriz, you and your family members, of course. Thank you so much. I'm into literature. I teach literature here in Azerbaijan, Shahid Madani University, and I teach drama. I often think of the way Professor Higgins and Pickering, Colonel Pickering, treat Eliza Doolittle in Pygmalion, in Pygmalion by George Bernard Shaw. I wonder if we can look at the problem between the problem between professor and the student from what you said, from cultural theories. If so, what I should look for if I want to apply a cultural theory, social cultural theory, to this relationship. I mean, what should I look for?
Okay, well, let me just give you a brief answer, I think. What you need to look for are what are the forms, what are the cultural forms that people have access to begin with, right? So if you think of it as, if we look at it from Bronfenbrenner's notion of ecological system, right? So you begin with the smallest, you think of it as concentric circles, moving from small to larger and larger and larger. So let's begin with the individual. And what's the first cultural experience that an individual typically has is of the family. So the first place you want to look to find culture is what goes on inside the family. What are the eating habits? What are the kinds of foods that people eat? What are the kinds of tools that people use to eat? So if you come from an Asian culture, people are eating with chopsticks, which means that food has to be prepared in a different way than if you eat with a knife and fork. So your understanding of food is immediately different if you come from a Western culture or a knife and fork culture and a chopstick culture, right? So how you think about food and how you cook food, how you prepare food is going to be different. So the concept of food, as it's presented in the family as a cultural concept, is immediately something that children have access to, that makes a real difference between eating in a knife and fork culture and eating in a chopstick culture. It's different. And then if you move outside of the family, you move into the institutions that the family participates in, whether they be schooling, how schools are structured, what the behavior is expected in the schools. So, I spend a lot of time now in China, and I see that Chinese schools, even though they share a lot of similarity with Western schools, there are a lot of differences in terms of how students are expected to behave relative to the teacher. So that the concept of schooling, the concept of education becomes different. That affects your psychology. You move out into things like political organizations, religious organizations, institutions, right? The public domain, where you shop for food, how you obtain your food, so on and so forth, what kind of jobs you have. All of that begins to affect the psyche of the individual. So you need to look at what are the cultural institutions and the cultural patterns that children have access to as they are brought into the culture, right? And they're going to be different. So what looks like a trivial difference between eating with chopsticks and eating with a knife and fork is not so trivial, because it defines the concept of food and how you eat, right? If you go into a cafeteria in China and you see students eating, they're eating in a very different way. It looks to a Western eye like they're being very rude because of the way they eat to a Western eye, right? But they're not, because it's culturally appropriate to eat in a certain way in a chopstick. You hold a bowl like this and you put the food in with the chopstick. We don't do that, right? We sit back and we cut the food and we eat in a different way. So the behaviors are different.
Thank you so much.
So that's what you have to look at.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Lantol. If you allow me, I would put one more question. I have had this question for many years.
Okay.
In reviewing the thesis, dissertations, research papers, we will find out that in many of the studies, let's say research studies, about, let's say, linguistic cognitive topics, the type of methodology is quantitative. And in socioculturally oriented studies, they are mainly qualitative. I was wondering about the necessity of this paradigmatic compatibility. How valid is such a necessity to observe a paradigmatic compatibility between, let's say, the research topic, between research topic and, let's say, the teaching.
Sorry, the teaching?
For example, studies about sociocultural topics, they are mainly qualitative. And studies about linguistic cognitive issues, they are mainly quantitative. It is argued that linguistic cognitive topics are more compatible with quantitative, let's say, methods, and the sociocultural is more compatible with qualitative, arguing that this is due to some sort of paradigmatic congruence.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. First of all, I don't think that's the case. I think one of the problems that we face because of the inheritance from the hard sciences, where quantification is important for sure, right? And mathematical modeling is important for sure, right? That we've imported that way of thinking into the human sciences, including psychology. Now, one of the problems that the field, that SLS, so Second Language Studies, I think is another sort of minor crisis, which is we've put the cart before the horse, as we say. So you often hear new graduate students talking about, well, I'm a quantitative researcher, I'm a qualitative researcher, and I do this or that kind of research. I think in the sociocultural, if you look at the sociocultural research from the time of Vygotsky, they never worried about that. Vygotsky's argument was, if you need to count things, if you need to quantify things, you quantify them. So if you look at some of the studies that Luria carried out he did a really interesting study between rural children's thinking and urban children's thinking, where he counted and he ran statistical analysis, right? So if you need to do that, you do it. If you don't need to do it, you don't do it. Vygotsky said, how many steam engines do I have to study to know how a steam engine works? Well, one is enough, right? So it depends on what you're trying to study, what you're trying to figure out. It's not trying to fit everything into a qualitative or a quantitative model. It's if you have to count things, you count things. And we've done that, right? If you look at the research that's being done now in dynamic assessment, they're trying to modify this learning potential score, which is a quantification it's a quantitative prediction of how well learners will react to instruction. So I don't think I would want to say that it may be the case that most of the studies done in sociocultural theory have been qualitative, but I don't think I want to say that the theory is only a theory that does qualitative research. It doesn't. There are people that count things. If you look at our journal, Language and Sociocultural Theory, there are a lot of papers that we publish that have a lot of statistical analysis in them. So I don't think that I would want to say that the theory is only a qualitative, lends itself better to qualitative than quantitative. It depends on what the problem is that you're working on.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, it seems with this we are coming to the end of this webinar, this session. So before wrapping up the session, I would like to thank Professor Lantalf one more time. He just he magnanimously honored our invitation, our request to deliver a webinar today. I also would like to thank our esteemed audience, participants, and a special thanks to the head of our faculty, Dr. Jafarian, the Deputy Dean for Educational Affairs, Dr. Shabidar, and Dr. Shabani, the head of our department. And final remarks for Professor Lantalf, and goodbye from me. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I apologize again for the mix-up at the beginning and the problems with the slides, but it worked out. And so I enjoyed it. I think the questions were great. You asked really good questions. And I'm happy to do it again at some point. It was really a pleasure. Thanks very much.
Much. Stay safe
Bye-bye.
and happy. Bye.
Yeah, thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.